Good morning. Are you awake? Yes? Are you awake? Awesome. Good morning and a very warm welcome to our Heräämö Extra Large event. And this event is part of our breakfast event series called Heräämö, but this time it's been extended and has gotten this extended name XL or XL addition to it because of its duration and content. Because in a normal Heräämö, we have one case presented and 2 hours time. But today, in this extra large Heräämö, we have 3 speakers, 3 hours time, and as you may see, twice as many participants as normally. We're very happy that you are here, so once more, welcome, that you wanted to come here this grey November morning. Now I would like to know how many of you are attending Heräämö event for the first time. Please raise your hands. Woo! Majority of you. Is there anyone who has been here before? Oh, almost half. Great. I hope to see the rest of you still next time because we have next Heräämö in December. But yeah, my name is Salla Nurminen and I'm your host today. Before we get started, I'm going to tell you some practical information. Then we move on to open the background of the event and of course introduce our fantastic speakers. I see that many of you have already found our breakfast here on the side. Great. And this event will be also live streamed, so we have many participants online. Welcome you all too. And I hope that you will also have nice breakfast there in front of you and lots of energy to follow us these upcoming hours. This video will be downloaded on YouTube afterwards. And you are mostly welcome to make notes during the presentations, but we will also share some presentation information and this video as part of LabLogi, which will be posted pretty soon after the event. And hashtags to be used on social media are SitraLab and Heräämö, and we encourage you to be active and use them. As you see, the language of the event is English due to our international speakers, but you may also pose questions in Finnish if that feels better, and we help you with the translation. And in table discussions, you can also, of course, choose whatever language suits you best. So, these Heräämö events are organized as part of SitraLab work, which is Sitra's own future laboratory. And now, I would like to introduce my colleague, Kalle Nieminen, to the stage with me.
Thank you, Salla.
Please come here with me. Okay. Yes.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. So, welcome, Kalle. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us a little bit more about SitraLab?
Of course. So, hi everyone, and welcome on my behalf as well. So, my name is Kalle Nieminen, and I'm leading SitraLab. So, Sitra is an organization that has called itself as a change agent for the last 10 years. And what makes a really good change agent? A good change agent knows what and why it is doing. What is the mission, what issues or what challenges it is tackling. But in SitraLab, we think that what makes the difference between good change agent and an amazing change agent is that an amazing change agent also knows how it approaches systemic change. What approaches, what methods, what tools, what skills and what capabilities it uses when approaching a systemic change and tackling the most wicked problems of our time. So that is what we are doing and what we are focusing on in SitraLab, on approaches, on methods, on capabilities and mindsets that organizations and individuals need when tackling the most wicked problems.
So, what do you think? Do we have a room full of change agents or change makers, how we usually call them in Sitra?
Well, Salla, I think there is no question about that. If you have an event that starts before 9 o'clock in a, as you say, dark November morning in Jätkäsaari with a pretty complex name of Societal Innovations and Global Challenges, and you still get a room full of people, I'm pretty sure that we have the right people, the real change makers here. What do you think?
Awesome. I believe that too. But still, why are we here?
Well, as I mentioned, in Sitra Lab, we focus on the how side of systemic change, how you make the systemic change happen. And we do that in 3 ways. First of all, we do research and development around the approaches, methods, and capabilities about systemic change. And under that topic, we are actually right now focusing on innovation portfolios and portfolio sense making. And if that is something that wakes you up or something you see interesting for your organization or for you, I'm more than happy to talk more about that. Just let me know. Secondly, we have a practice-led training program. For every training cohort, we collect 30 change makers with an open call. These 30 change makers go through a 12-day, an intense 12-day program concerning system thinking, future thinking, co-design, and that's all on social innovation process. The next open call will be open later this year, actually. Last but not least, thirdly, we have an amazing community of change makers. With these open events and with the Facebook group that already has more than 1,400 people in it, we want to offer a platform for everybody to learn from each other and learn about how to do the systemic change in a complex world. And we have been really happy with all the feedback that you have given us. These events are actually growing more quickly than we expected, or what do you think, Salla?
Oh, yes.
For example, before this event, we had to say more than 50 people that the event is already fully booked. Hopefully you are all there online and listening us. Probably next year we have to change places with Slush, or what do you think?
Well, now when you mention Slush, maybe some of you have noticed, and the rest of you who have not noticed yet, I'm gonna tell you that this event just won Slush Most Sustainable Site Event Prize or Challenge. Oh, yes. So we got this honor because the Sustainable Development Goals are at the heart of the event, and we hope to encourage people who identifies themselves as change makers of the future, no matter which background or sector they come from. So we welcome all. Yeah, so it's pretty nice that you all are here in this Most Sustainable Slush Site event.
Once more.
Once more, yes. And now, Kalle, would you like to present our speakers?
Well, that's my honor. Today's speakers and their organizations represent some of the most interesting international innovation practitioners and experts. Or let me put it this way, they are the rock stars of innovation scene, and we have them all here today. We have Piret Tunurist from OECD's Observatory for Public Sector Innovation. We have Joseph de Grasse from UNDP's Global Accelerator Labs, and Indy Johar from Dark Mother Labs. And I want to warmly welcome you all to Helsinki with us. And for everyone else who are here today with us, I hope you all will have an interesting and probably intense morning. And there's one thing I want you to keep in your mind. Please try to find a couple of things, couple of learnings that you can take with you and probably use in your own organization and in your own context. Let's keep that in mind this morning. And I want to warmly welcome you all also.
Thank you, Kalle.
Thank you.
So, as you already heard, we have 3 presentations, each with a moment for reflection. After the 2 first presentations, we have a moment or an opportunity for networking. And after the 3rd presentation, we have time for collective discussion. My colleague Mikael Seppälä will be making some notes and questions for the speakers during these presentations, but we hope to receive questions also from you and from the people who are following us online. Piret Tynnerist will be our first speaker to take the stage. Piret is originally from our close neighbor country, Estonia. But these days, she works in the city of Eiffel Tower, in OECD's Observatory for Public Sector Innovation. If you are interested in the renewal of public sector, Piret Tynnerist is an essential name to follow. Please, Piret, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So the sun is getting slowly but surely getting out. So we can also start our discussion about how to actually make system change happen in practice as well. So I, at the Observatory Public Sector Innovation, work as a lead of system thinking and anticipatory innovation. And I also want to say that I work within an organization of 3,500 people in one of the most rigid organizations in the world, which is governed by diplomatic rules and procedures and governments coming together behind very long tables and having very structured discussions. So this is not a kind of an easy place to have an innovation lab in. So I know if you're thinking about innovation is hard or making change is hard, so I just want to say that I also feel your pain. So I also feel your pain within my own organization, that you actually need to make these changes within these big organizations as well, and it's never easy. So you have to actually put a lot of effort into it. And today I want to actually concentrate on two different points. So how to get started in systemic change or transformation, and also how to keep it going. So you have a great system thinker within Finland as well, and one of the great system thinkers here has said that implementation is where ideas go to die. So you might start with a very good idea, but implementation is usually where it goes to die. So this is the kind of the guiding question as such. And around this implementation problem, that we know that climate change is an issue, we know that poverty is an issue, we know that we have these complex issues around all these sustainable development goals, and yet somehow we keep on going from millennial goals to sustainable development goals, and we're really not, changing things on the ground. So we keep on talking about things, but a lot of things are not happening. And for me, this is associated with three problems. And I'm sure that there are hundreds of different other problems connected to this, but I have 20 minutes and I want to talk about three. So first of all, knowing and knowing. So it's one thing to actually know that something is a problem. The other side of the thing is to actually internalize it, to actually feel the urgency yourself. So we might know that mobility is an issue. Artificial intelligence will create new challenges. Social media is actually creating privacy issues for ourselves. We live in aging societies in most countries. But it doesn't mean that knowing these issues that you actually get to real change. So what we do in practice is to actually translate these problems or issues into the fact that this is not something you come in a gray November morning in Härama to talk about, but this is your daily job. So this is actually what you have to do every single day. So you have to actually think about these issues as part of your job. So to create the connection of this is not something separate, something to look into a workshop, but this has to be connected to your job. So we have developed a model to actually talk about the purpose of innovation. So change has to be connected to the purpose and your job. So we have 4 different questions that can connect to any single civil servant or public sector employee, connected to how might we actually achieve the goals, what we want to achieve. How might we do what we do better? How might we adapt to the evolved situations on the ground? And how might we anticipate future upcoming possibilities and risks for our citizens? And these are core 4 questions that if you answer yes at least once to those questions, your job is to do innovation. Your job is to be a change maker. And if you didn't answer yes to any of these, then my question is, what are you doing in the public sector? It's maybe time to go and develop a startup or make a business of your own and do something else, because this is your job. So this is what you need to do. And when we talk about these issues and problems, that this is actually what you need to do every single day. And you need to get into the business of knowing your tools of a trade. So connected to the questions that you're actually thinking about, there are different ways of going about it. And especially important here is to say that tools and methods are not objective. They're normative. They will push you towards certain types of solution. So if you work in an agile sort of way or you use human-centered design, you tend to look at problems from a certain perspective. If you look at lean, if you look at system thinking, horizon scanning, regulatory sandboxes, it actually frames your problems, the type of work you do. It actually directs you into different activities. So system thinking for us can be used in different formats, but system thinking is excellent at looking at issues and problems and framing them. So actually getting to the purpose at hand, getting to the sustainable development goals. And it's not a cheap methodology. It is not something that is extremely easy to do. It actually requires a lot of investment and time. So if you already know what needs to be done, go and do it. Don't invest in different types of methodologies. But if you are dealing with complex problems and purposes within the public sector, this is a good way to go. And translating into these questions into specific innovations, we here in the system thinking field, we will actually talk about missions as well. About missions regarding water purity, regarding plastic-free oceans, regarding poverty, regarding social welfare. These are concrete purposes that governments and civil servants actually have to reach. Secondly, second problem. It is one thing to know what the issue is. It's another thing to do something about it. So knowing and doing do not always follow course. So in that sense that you might do a systems analysis about an issue, a welfare problem, and you actually frame the issue in a certain way. You understand all the interconnected factors that are connected to child issues or child policy issues that are connecting to children, for example. But it doesn't mean that you can do something about it. So system thinking is also produces these kind of very complex and complicated maps of everything is connected to everything. And then you look at the map and you are actually quite confused. What is going on? So this is a concrete example from my own work. So this is something that we did in my home country in Estonia beginning of this year, to look at what is holding them back from reaching the missions that they want to reach. So we did a systems analysis on the policy-making system of Estonia. And such a complex different factors emerge about what actually affects reaching those goals. So, and actually complexity paralysis also emerges. So in a sense that we can know that flat hierarchies and silos and overarching visions that are really abstract actually influence how you reach those missions. But what are we going to do about this? This is quite complicated. How are we going to actually start working in this field? We are doing this work in Slovenia on the procurement system. It's one of the most kind of legalistic systems in its entirety. But yet you see that actually the problems are behavioral, are cultural, are risk-taking, are capacity issues. And just changing the law doesn't help things. So how do you chance changing things of where the problems are actually interconnected to all the technology, capacity, and perception that need to at least change at the same time? So what we do in reality is to actually define a purpose, to find a new purpose for the system. So it is very difficult to change a system that is interconnected and has all of these different factors connected to it, to just say, change it. What you have to actually do is to define purposes about what this purpose has to actually deliver. So procurement systems are not made for just as is. They're usually operated that way. But the reality is that they're there to get you things in a more cost-efficient manner, in a timely manner, but they're also there to fulfill social, economical goals. It's an arm of the government, a very influential arm of the government, that actually helps you do innovation as well. So these are very different, complicated purposes that actually need to be framed to be actionable. And when you do a problem framing exercise connected to the system at hand, then you can start comparing also what needs to change within that complicated system to actually deliver that purpose. So you're not only paralyzed within the complexity of it all, you have an aim in mind. And you analyze your complexity based on that aim in mind. So one of the tools we use as well is a mission planning canvas to actually make the value proposition first for the public and the private sector, because you want all players to work together. And then to start analyzing all the different things that are important to make that system actually work and deliver that purpose at hand. So, and then you can also say that things become quite easy in terms of the motivation. So either you reach the purpose or you don't reach the purpose. You have to redefine continuously to do that. So we have different tools and methods to actually frame problems in different ways, and different problems actually need different tools to do problem laddering and actually understand the methods of what is going on within that problem itself. Climate change is not the same problem as poverty. They might be actually interconnected. One might affect the other in different ways. Procurement problem is definitely not the climate change problem. So you have to actually look at these problems in different ways as well. Sometimes you're dealing with puzzles. So in a sense that you have all the information and pieces, but you need different ways of putting them together. So you need an actual outside perspective, or a new person in the room, or a new capacity in the room to bring that in to look at the problem in a new and different way. So you have to think about what kind of a problem that I'm dealing with. You can also have mysteries. A lot of things within the public sector, even if experts do not want to admit it, are actually mysteries. In a sense that you see the outcome, and you see that there are things going into this problem, but what happens in the black box is a total mystery. It's a Bermuda triangle. Planes go over, sometimes they go down, sometimes they stay up, but planes disappear. So it's a mystery in that sense. And quite a lot of issues within the public sector still, because of social behavior and interconnectedness of different behaviors, are still mysteries, in a sense that you can't know. So bringing, all the world's experts within that room is not going to help. You actually have to start doing, because you see the reaction, you see the outcome, but you don't know what is going on. But you can still do, you can still take action and see how it actually interacts with the system itself to see the outcomes. It doesn't mean that you have to be paralyzed. But analyzing those problems that are mysteries, messes, puzzles, or just, the usual kind of things on the kind of the low-hanging fruit, just fucking do it problems. Then you have to analyze your problems as well to do it in different ways. Third issue and third problem that I wanted to talk about is powerful feeling powerless. The agency. So we can get through our tools and methods into knowing, and really knowing in a sense that this is my job. Getting to the heart of it, this is my job, that I know this problem and I know that this is my job to do something about it. Secondly, that we get to the fact that we actually know what needs to be done about it. So even if we have these mysteries, problems at hand, we know that we need to start doing. And we have a problem ladder or a systems map or a systems dynamics analysis about what's going on. We know what the next step is. But yet, public sector, also in the private sector, this step doesn't get taken. Because people who are actually very powerful do not feel that they have agency to cross silos, to break their organizational barriers, to actually work in new ways to get to the heart of the problem itself. This might feel funny, but I have to say that in my work, 100%, in all of the countries I've been working with, I can interview secretary generals, director generals, all of these people who are one of the most powerful civil servants in the world, in that country, for example, most powerful civil servants within that country. And they say, well, I can't do anything about this because this is not fully in my domain. It's actually that ministry's problem. And then you're like, well, you are one of the 12 most powerful people. If you can't do it, who can do it then? So what do you actually do about it? So you can have a systems map. You say that your overall silos don't work. Your ministries are not structured in the way of the actual problem because we have defined certain issues a certain way. But you still want to solve that problem in regardless. So how do you actually get to the fact that somebody needs to act, and somebody needs to act beyond the system, that, you know, beyond the Ministry of Welfare, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of even Defense, to make these things happen. So where is that change point that you need to do? And a lot of the problems are, you know, if only put on the individual, that they depend on that individual. So individuals burn out, crash out, get bored, get frustrated, and they leave. So if you only leave it up to the individual, you have a very fragile strategy of actually making system change. But yet you need to, in our work, so what we actually do as well, is that we try to develop different mentalities for leaders. So different types of leaders need different tools of help. But when we're really kind of working on the ground of making changes, then we start with the most motivated partners within the system, regardless of how powerful or powerless they are. So if you are motivated, you know, you can be in a faraway ministry of, you know, Natural Resources Canada, but you want to deal, you're most motivated to deal with the talent question within the system, then that's fine with us. Because you have levers regardless of where you are in the system itself. So you just have to do the analysis within a different way. So you're not taking that we have to, you know, have to start from the point of I have to have all of these ministries together of the simple mind in the same room, in a working party, and in a consensus about how to deal with this. It's like, no, the real world doesn't work like this. So we start with the most motivated party, and we start with the analysis to say, if we really are committed to delivering this change on the ground, who do we have to convince? How do we convince them? But we start acting already now. We ourselves will do a demonstration case. We will do a pilot. And we'll start acting now. But when we're doing this coalition buildings and going around, and sometimes the most influential player is, you know, really doesn't want to get involved because some of these things are really challenging for these organizations. But you actually develop a system strategy of leadership, of motivation, to actually do that. And what really works on very well on the ground is the human nature. And that is competition and jealousy. So, you know, if you truly want to have change, and these are the partners I'm looking for in countries as well, is that we can make anything happen, regardless if you have the right players in the room. Because part of the process is to get the right players in the room. Jealous, competitive, whatever the motivation is, but willing to act. So we developed these different roles for our system players as well to actually work in total. Example of systems change on land, we also do these leadership developments to actually redefine their role and how they act within the organizations. So usually they are managing crises or delivering results, and nobody wants to, you know, has the time to actually empower their staff or influence future agendas. So we have to actually kind of change the mindset on the ground to do that. So these were the kind of the three challenges that I fundamentally deal with. There are 120 others that contextually come because the problems that I deal with every day in my work are different. The projects that I deal with in my way are different. So it's always a moving target, in a sense that if you deal with complex problems, if you deal with wicked problems, the once you solve something, something else pumps up. In a sense that you keep 3 planes up in the Bermuda Triangle, 7 boats go down. You know, you influence something and new problems emerge. So it's always a kind of dynamic issue that you have to deal with. So it is not about knowing about system thinking methods, but it's more about practicing them. You can't actually know all the methodologies. There are 70 years of different tools and methods to draw upon. You actually have to know the problem that you're dealing with to choose the methods that you do with. And also keep in mind that problems are changeable in time. So it's not like economic policy or traditional economic policy where you have one solution on hand, and when it doesn't work on the ground, it's your fault. No, problems change over time. So you have to actually choose different policies and measures and methodologies once the problem moves, once the problem matures. You deal with it and new problems emerge as well. So different approaches with different thinking, 70 years of different methods to actually choose from. But do not love the method, love the problem. Different tactics to actually do that as well. And here I actually want to say, for the final point as well, is that do not only love the people you know, also include people you don't. So it's the fastest way to fail for us as well is to only invite the people you know about the problem. You have to have new perspectives to introduce transformative change within the public sector. I'll keep this, you will get all the slides as well about some examples about how we work. But fundamentally, I cannot, or my team cannot solve all the problems on the ground itself. So our role within the system is to not only address wicked problems or sustainable development goals, but actually develop throughout our different country partners the capacity to do it continuously on the ground themselves. So my goal, my purpose at hand is to become irrelevant and to, in the future, to find a new job. Thank you very much.
Mikki on käynnissä. Yes. What a great start for the morning. Thank you for this inspiring presentation. Yes, once more. So, what kind of questions stood out from the presentation? Anyone who wants to start? My colleague Mia here will bring you the microphone. It's always nice to be the first one. Please just raise your hand over there in the back.
Hi. My question is with corruption.
Just a second. I think the microphone.
Microphone.
Yeah, how do you deal with microphones was the first question. So
Yeah. How do you deal with corruption as a wicked problem within systems thinking?
That's
yes. It should be on.
Okay.
Yes, maybe
closer.
a little bit closer. Yeah,
It's a
that
bit
helps.
closer.
Yes.
Indeed. So how do you deal with corruption? So in most Western democracies, actually, corruption is not as big of an issue as you think. So if you look at all the numbers, so how we deal with corruption in Slovenia, for example, that we're doing procurement. And every single week in Slovenia, the media is really fixated on a topic, and there's a discussion about how the tunnel procurement was corrupt, and how the road procurement was corrupt, and how the healthcare system procurements are corrupt. In reality, when we see the numbers and the volumes and actually look at the numbers, it is on average on every single European public sector in terms of corruption. In reality. So it's an average issue. So what tends to happen is that it's more of a perception problem than rather a kind of a reality problem. So what we see in many different countries is that they tend to overinvest into dealing with corruption and change the overall system. So 99% of the people have to deal with harsher regulations, while the 1% always finds a way. So I have not seen a country yet where they have actually dealt with the corruption in reality, because humans will be humans. Humans will find a way to, find ways to make deals, let's say. But then it's the question as well, it's a hard question that I actually have to think about in system thinking terms as well, is that how much do you want to actually deal with this? So how much do you want to make the system harder for the 99% who is performing in accordance to the rules versus the 1% that you have to deal with? And in our case, for example, I just came from Slovenia, I just flew in from Ljubljana last night, is that they are investing heavily towards that 1%. And the 99% is suffering. They can't do any innovative procurements anymore. They can't do any socioeconomic procurements anymore because the rules of the game are so complex, and that administrative burden goes up. And all the analysis actually shows that it's pointless. The 1% doesn't move because of those rules. So if you look at these complex issues or wicked issues from that regard, you have to make a choice. You have to actually address these issues in a very targeted way to actually make room for the rest of the system to function better. So not to punish, we are moving beyond the kind of Tayloristic mass production system as well. Not having Tayloristic mass production solutions for corruption, that you actually make room for the rest of the public sector to innovate regardless of it as well.
Well, that was a big question. I think we had one over there who was the second one. Oh, just a moment.
Hi. So my question will a little be related, because you can't make a change if you are just part of the system. You need to have some resources. You can't just come and say people change, people will not change. So what is exactly the resources you need? Is it some kind of official positions that you are manager and you give orders, or what kind of actual resources do you need for change?
Mm-hmm. So that is an excellent question, and also pertaining to one of the major problems I saw as well, because, Secretary Generals in different countries say, we don't have the resources to do this. We can't do this. And they have budgets, but their budgets are dedicated. I think if you're motivated enough, you can actually start the change process anywhere within the organization itself. So find partners, find, people who actually think the same way as well. So in my own organization within the OECD, we have a topic that I can't mention. It is a problem within the OECD. It's a serious problem within the OECD itself. But there's no interest in actually dealing with it. I don't have no mandate over this issue. But we have started a community of people who are motivated in actually doing something about it. So we're building up towards that. So money and time are always going to be issues. Everywhere I also hear that we don't have the time or the money to do this kind of work. There are always going to be issues, but these are trade-offs and choices to make. In the short term, doing this work is expensive for your resources and your money. If you actually reach the goals that you want to reach, it's going to be rather cheap over time. Because if you solve an issue that has been plaguing your organizations for quite some while, then you are actually, saving money in the long term, or at least there's a potential to save money in the long term. So I would say that only money, in terms of resources, not only the resource itself. You have social capital, you have social movements, you can start those movements within yourself. But the question is, are you motivated enough? Are you motivated actually to do something about it? And for us as well in our work, we have to raise the ambition level of our partners so they become motivated. So a lot of our tools that initially when we start these processes are actually about behavioral manipulations or psychology of what kind of motivational tools actually work. So how do I have to tell this story to this manager, or how do I have to tell this story for this group so they get a little bit of spark underneath them as well. Or short answer.
Okay, so we have time for one short question and answer. And I would like to know, because we have as many participants as here, we have following us online. So is there any questions? No, they are still quiet. Okay, so maybe questions for Joseph then. But hey, thanks a lot, and we continue to the next speaker. Yes,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. We can continue with the normal one. It feels just weird. I have two microphones here, but at least people can hear me, right? Yes, great. So, our second speaker has great experience of the power of networks. Joseph Cruz, who is originally from Malaysia, but these days working in UNDP's headquarters in New York. He supports UNDP's Accelerator Labs networks, which functions in 60 countries. And the aim of the network is to be the fastest learning network in the whole world. We will hear more about this in a few seconds. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let's continue at 10:30. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think it's time for the coffee break. Here we are. All right. What I want to do this morning is to tell you a story about what we're doing, and hopefully, in the context of that, tell you another story embedded in it about why we're doing it. And then if we have time, and this will mostly be in the questions, I think, to also confess all the things that we haven't quite figured out yet about how to do what we're trying to do. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, the story I want to tell you about today is about an initiative that we've developed in UNDP to create a network of accelerator labs with the aim of creating the world's fastest learning network on solving development problems. And I want to try and cover 4 very brief things, just to add one more to Piret's 3, which is why we're doing what we're doing, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why is UNDP doing it. And I'm going to kind of start at the bottom with UNDP and work our way up, because tomorrow, as I'm sure everybody in the audience knows, is a very special day. It is the 54th anniversary of the founding of UNDP. Hands up anybody who actually knew that. Don't worry. And for an organization that was set up 54 years ago with the aim to be the United Nations Systems primary development agency, the agency that was tasked to help the developing world advance, 54 years is long overdue for a midlife crisis. Luckily, we're not facing a midlife crisis, but we have spent the last couple of years thinking very deeply, not only about what we do, but about how we go about doing what we do in the world that we live in today, which, as Piret alluded to just now, is a highly complex world where, to put it simply, most of the simple development problems in the world have largely been solved. And the ones that we as an organization and we as the global community are left with are the tricky, complex, wicked problems. So how do you set up an organization to help the world deal with those? And that was the question of why. And we talk about this internally in reference to a graph that was actually developed and shared with us by someone who's about to speak after me. And this is a graph that talks about the fact that when you look at the speed and scale at which complex problems are emerging in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's technological advance, whether it is growing inequality within and between countries, whether it is the fracturing of societal systems and structures and the coherence of the societies that we depend on, when you look at all those problems, it is pretty clear that these problems are growing at a rate that far exceeds the rate at which we're coming up with solutions. So we're losing the battle. And in that context, for an organization like ours, the challenge is not just to do what we've been doing better, but to think deeply about different approaches. Otherwise, you just keep falling behind. So we're an organization facing a gamut of 21st century problems. At the age of 54 years old, being an organization that was designed and mandated to deal with 20th century problems. And so we came down to 3 key questions that you can see on the screen here behind me. How do we better tackle complex and fast-moving challenges? How do we find the most relevant solutions that work locally? Because one of the key insights that we came to was that most of the solutions that are required are highly context-specific. Not just because countries differ, but also because communities, neighborhoods, cities, localities, groups of people, groups of identities are different, and the solutions that work in one very specific multidimensional context do not automatically translate into another. So to give you an example, here in Finland, I know from talking to friends and colleagues that there is a growing issue around aging societies, the demographic transitions around that play off in different ways in rural areas versus urban areas. This is in many ways, at a headline level, exactly the same story that you see in Thailand or in Malaysia. But we cannot assume that a solution that's developed here in Finland could simply be transported to Thailand or vice versa. And last but not least, given that the problems are complex and that the contexts are very, very specific, how do we actually learn more quickly about what works and what doesn't? The assumption being that the only way in which you know what is applicable on the ground is to try it, to adapt, and to learn, and to refine what you're doing as you go along. So what are we doing? What we decided to do is to establish an initiative with the highly audacious and almost impertinent task of catalyzing positive change by finding and sharing solutions as fast and as rapidly as anyone in the world has ever tried to do. So we set ourselves the ambition of working with a group of partners to set up the world's largest and fastest learning network embedded within our organization. What does this look like? To start off with, we have established teams in 60 of our offices, covering 78 countries, encompassing the majority of the developing world, mandated to be the initial nodes in this network. Small 3-person teams embedded within our existing offices, and our offices range in size from about 30 people up to about 300, whose job it is to create a network using new skills and new capacities to speed the rate at which we find and solve problems. Oh, sorry. You'll also notice when you look at the map that the network itself is segmented in some unusual ways. First of all, roughly half the network is in continental Africa. The reason being that we are of the conviction that if we are going to solve the development problems of the next couple of decades, the space that's really going to matter is Africa. Secondly, you'll see that the countries that we cover here are of a broad typology. So we have everything from labs that work in the small island states in the Pacific, to a lab in Buenos Aires that works in Argentina, to a lab in Delhi in India, where we have 3 extremely smart and competent colleagues sitting in the office going, how the heck do we come up with solutions for India? So we're working at a span of different contexts and typologies, and we're also working in different types of countries. About a quarter of the countries that you see on this list are what we call conflict and fragile countries. Countries that are either pretty much at the moment in a state of sustained conflict or just emerging out of it. About 25% of them are also less developed countries, and a majority of the others are middle income and upper middle income countries. So quite advanced societies and economies, all down through to places where we're still dealing with the remnants of hot war. The reason we developed a network of this diversity is precisely because we believe a diversity in the network allows us to learn and speed up the scale of learning faster. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly because I just want to tell the story of what we're doing and then talk a little bit more about the why and the how. So the lab network works in a very simple way. A core team of colleagues equipped with a suite of tools and methodologies, a starter kit, so to speak, and I'll come into what these are later, with a way of working that essentially tasks them to speed up the rate at which we test and explore solutions within our existing portfolios, embedded within our existing teams, working side by side with the existing colleagues in our UNDP offices in these locations and their partners, their counterparts, and their local ecosystems, networked together around the world, using the best we have at the moment in terms of tools, protocols, tweaks for culture, tweaks for communication systems to encourage this cohort of people to share not just solutions and successes, which is the default of what is shared in bureaucracies, but also to share failures, which we always aspire to share intuitions, to share hunches, to share uncertainties. And we assume, and we are building this on the assumption that the network effects of sharing that depth of insight across a network will surface intuitions and weak signals that we can then glean for the benefit of our work overall. How? We've equipped these teams with a suite of initial tools, and I stress very much initial tools to get them started. And these map into 4 broad areas. Firstly, around sense making. Tools and approaches to let our teams get a better sense of what is happening in the environments within which they operate. This is everything from ethnography to the use of big data, collective intelligence tools, etc., so that our teams and our partners on the ground have a deeper and wider sense of what is going on. What are the problems that we are seeing? Are these emerging in ways that we have not expected? Are there nuances or implications of these that we do not expect? And are there people working on them that we don't ordinarily see in our networks? Leveraging collective intelligence, as you say, simply the wisdom of the crowd, activated either through online platforms or through peer-to-peer learning on the ground. Working to map solutions. And this is very important because one of the key insights we've learned from talking to colleagues in the space is by the time people like us come into an environment and understand that a problem exists, you can bet there are people who live and breathe and work in those contexts who are already working on solutions. And one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest mistakes we have made in international development for a long time is to come into a context and assume that when we figured out what the problem is, we then have to solve that problem. Ignoring the fact that very often on the ground, individuals, households, local communities, startups, government officials themselves have already been hacking solutions. And where you start is to first of all figure out who's already identified the problem and is working on it, and how do you bring them together into a network to leverage the expertise they already have and the resources they have available. So that is a key insight for us. And then out of all of this, how do we build protocols, partnerships, systems, resources to be able to rapidly test simultaneous portfolios of solutions? Because the other problem we've had working traditionally in development is that we have taken a very linear approach to the problem. Go in, do a diagnosis, design a project, implement a project. If you're lucky, while you're implementing the project, you might learn something. At the end of that process, learn the lessons you've learned, and then start the cycle again, rinse and repeat. And on average, in international development, a cycle like that takes 3 to 5 years. What we aim to do in this case is to start developing portfolios that we run at a pace of weeks or months simultaneously, so we're rapidly testing hypotheses all at the same time. The cycle the lab teams are trained to do is a 4-step. Sense what's going on. Understand the problem, understand the symptoms that might indicate there is a problem. Explore, both for local solutions, as well as looking for solutions across our collective network. Design and test portfolios of intuitions, hunches, experiments that may give you a sense of how the system reacts. And when you find a solution that potentially might work, look at whether that solution is scalable, whether it can grow. Because that's very often the acid test, whether that solution is robust or not. Our teams are now working on a protocol that pushes them to work through this cycle at 100-day sprints. They're at the moment in the first 30 days, the first 100-day cycle. And we're doing this for learning purposes, to push our teams to run through this sequence as often as possible so we build the skill sets and the muscle memory of how to do this rapidly. Very quickly, and we'll come back to this later on because I want to have time for us to have a discussion as well. Sense making, looking for patterns, identifying relevance gaps. Exploration, tapping into uncommon data sources, talking to unusual suspects, looking not just for rigorous, evidence-based, tested data and solutions, but hints, intuitions, hunches, informal solutions, signals that signal there may be a way of solving this problem that we have often in the past overlooked because it did not meet that highly technocratic, evidence-based benchmark of what we consider to be a viable solution. Using collective intelligence as well, mapping sets of signals, sets of conversations to be able to extract out of those signals what can actually be going on the ground. Design and test, run portfolios, run quick experiments, do sprints to be able to very rapidly iterate through different interventions that might shift a system. And then when you find solutions that potentially could work, use the network to signal that outwards. Not to grow these by replicating them ourselves, but sharing these so that other people within a country can take them and scale them up, whether in government or elsewhere. Using these to influence government policy, so you shift the machinery of government to be able to work on these parts. And also looking to see whether these solutions are things that could be scaled out independently. Whether the group of people you bring together to hack a solution might be the nucleus of a startup or an NGO that could then essentially drift off from us into the local ecosystem to work together, or whether you're developing solutions that should actually be scaled through the private sector, spun off into ventures, given away as free IP to companies that may want to commercialize and use them, both within country and elsewhere. So that's the cycle. Now, the really interesting question, why on earth are we doing this? I started with this at the beginning, which is, we know as a development organization working on the ground in some of the toughest places in the world, that the set of solutions we have today are insufficient. They're not wrong. We're doing a lot of very good work on the ground, solving simple and complicated problems, and helping address many of the symptoms of the complex problems that the communities we work with are grappling with. But they're insufficient because we know we do not have the toolkits, the approaches, the resources, and the mental frames to be able to deal with the genuinely complex system-wide problems. As an international bureaucracy, we are not designed to deal with complex, ambiguous problems. We are designed to deal with clearly defined problems, complicated problems that can be broken down into pieces, where by solving each individual piece, you can roll up a solution for the whole. In a sense, we are designed for complicated engineering problems, not complex social problems. But when you're working in development, you're working intrinsically on complex social problems. So the why is simply that in order to do the job we need to do, we need to develop the skills and the tools and the approaches to be able to solve for complex systems problems. Let me talk a little bit now about the story within the story, why we're doing what we're doing. And I'll do that while I run through the slides that talk behind me about what UNDP is, because most of you are probably familiar with this. When we started thinking about how you take a bureaucracy of 17,000, 18,000 people working on the ground in 170 countries and communities, embedded within an international civil service, and we started thinking about how you spark change, one of the first points we came to is that the only way in which you can do this is by doing two things. One, jumping into the middle of the problem and starting to act. So we designed this initiative in the space of something like 4 months. From conceptualization to design to resourcing to startup. We set up and established these teams in the space of about another 6 months, which if any of you know the UN as a system or any given government style bureaucracy, going from idea to 180 people recruited, $85 million resources generated, a project up and running in 60 countries in very different locations in the space of less than a year is astounding. And we did it simply because we didn't break rules, because we are an international civil service and we don't break rules, but we bent as many as we needed to. We got permission from our leadership to just go ahead and do it. And that gave us a tremendous power, which is it sent a signal within the organization that it is possible for those people who believe we need to do something different to go out there and just do it. And the second intuition driving this is that the only way in which an organization like ours can develop the ability to deal with complex problems is by putting in an infrastructure at scale to do this simultaneously in many places. And I'll give you a confession here. When we first started talking about this idea with my boss, the head of UNDP, those of us who were kind of the champions of it said to him, look, we think we need to have a large network of labs. We need maybe 60 of them, and we'll set these up over the course of about 3 years. And Akim turned to us and went, it's a great idea. Yes, we're going to do this, and you're going to set up all 60 labs in the first year. Which is the point in time, by the way, that whatever hair I had left fell off my head. But he had a very simple point, which is if you're going to change a system, if you're going to spark a change in a large system, sometimes the signal needs to be strong enough that the entire system reacts. Pilot experiments are useful when you want to learn something, when you want to shift an entire system. Sometimes you need to insert basically a viral injection that changes the nature of the DNA of the entire organization. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now. By virtue of doing this, we're signaling to the organization that not only do we need to deal with complex problems, but that we need to go ahead and start doing it even if we haven't figured out all the solutions of how to do it. And we've signaled to the organization that if we are serious about being the world's leading development agency of the United Nations, when we do something like this, we have to be able to do it at scale. Not to say to our partners and governments, we're going to pilot this for 5 years and then write a report and then come back to you and maybe try doing it for another 5 years. Very last point on this, before I wrap up and move to questions. As we've entered into this process, this is really giving away the dirty secrets now. We're very conscious of the fact that a number of the things that we need in order to make this network successful, we don't have yet. Number one, we have given the teams we have on the ground an initial toolkit of methods, approaches, mental frameworks gleaned from many of the people around here, including people like Pirette and Indy and others, as an initial starter kit of solutions they could use. We know perfectly well these are insufficient. So as the teams work on the ground, we are still assembling the tools, approaches, methodologies they might need to do their jobs. Secondly, we know that this is only going to work if we develop a way for these teams on the ground to network amongst themselves at the speed and scale I talked about. Being a team and a culture that shares not just solutions and tested case studies, but uncertainties, risks, failures, intuitions, hunches. Within an international civil service, a highly global system of people from very different cultures working in different contexts, building the culture, the platform, the tools for sharing at that level is unprecedented. And right now, we haven't built that yet. We're working on it, but we're nowhere close to being where we need to be. And if we don't solve for that, we're not going to have a network, we're just going to have a collection of labs. So we're in that very uncertain space of knowing that one of the key bases of what we want to do hasn't been created yet. And last but not least, because there's been a tremendous amount of interest in what these labs are doing, we're also solving for the problem of a lot of people all over the world not only wanting to know what we're doing, but wanting to engage. And so we need to build a platform on which all of this sits that allows any of you and anyone else in the world who's interested to observe what our lab teams are doing, learn from that, and contribute seamlessly without having to navigate and arbitrage thousands of different individual interactions. So we've got lab teams with an insufficient toolkit of solutions, built on a network that itself is a work in progress, built on a platform that doesn't yet exist. And we're live at the moment, and we're doing this on the ground. And what we're hoping for is to find people out there who can help us solve all those questions all at once. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Please stay there, because we have questions for you. And I know at least we have one question online. So maybe, Riina, if you say it out loud, and I will repeat it so that we will hear it on stream as well.
Okay. Actually, I got two questions.
Okay, great.
One is really brief, and it's the question that when has UNDP started this new phase of labs and that?
Okay, let's start with that one. When has UNDP started with a new phase of labs?
We announced in January this year, we launched in July. Our lab teams are all on the ground and working as of last month. Short answer.
Oh, wow, that was a short one.
Yes.
So do we have another question online?
Yes. And the question is that how did you build the networks locally? Was it just an open invitation for everyone?
So how do you build those networks locally? Was it just an open invitation?
That's a good question, actually. So in each of the 60 locations where we set up these networks, these labs, we gave the teams basically a menu of potential ways in which they could go out and engage with their local ecosystem. And these are all things that are used very often in the innovation community. We said, look, put out the word, use social media, set up hackathons, invite people to come into the office and talk to them, go out to the spaces where innovators, entrepreneurs, government officials gather and talk about our labs. And then we told all of them, in your local context, pick the approaches you think might work best, go ahead and do them, but very importantly, share and document what you're doing, so that other teams can also learn simultaneously from you what works best, what doesn't, how do you hack the initial set of ideas we gave you to make them better. And one of the nicest bits about this was we not only created an immediate community amongst our teams in these 60 places, sharing very simple things like how do you hold a launch event? And if you're going to hold an open day and a challenge and a hackathon, what are the tools and toolkits? But sharing amongst themselves templates, zero drafts, documents, videos, tweets back and forth, and generating across this network a wonderful little competition about who can do the coolest launch events. So that's how we got them to figure out in their local context what works, using a starting point of a common toolkit, each of which is then adapted but shared across the network again.
So sharing is at the core of the work.
Sharing is caring.
Sharing
yes.
is caring. Do we have questions here? One over there. Would you like to give a microphone? I think the microphone reaches there. Just about.
Hi. Thank you for an exciting speech. And talking about the experimentation nature of all of this that we do, how is the license to fail promoting? How do you promote that license to fail in the public sector, which doesn't tolerate it's social welfare, taxpayers' money, etc.? If you could put in some insights.
That's a really good question, actually. And forgive me, I'm very undiplomatic sometimes, so I'll just be very frank. The first thing you need to do, I think, is you need to go to the people who give you a license to operate, whoever they are. Your bosses, your sponsors, your governing authority, etc. And you gently need to point out to them that you're failing already. Okay? Because that was, as I said just now, that was our starting point, which is to say to everybody around us, look, we know, and again I phrase this very carefully, that the solutions we have to offer today are insufficient. We all know the scale of the problems out there are such that the way we're doing things right now just isn't good enough. And then you contextualize. And the context for us in talking to our sponsors and our governing board was actually quite simple. As an organization, we transact about $5 billion a year. Okay, so that's $5 billion of other people's money that's being spent to try and solve development problems on the ground. This idea is a $50 million a year bet. You think about this, you take a step back and you go in any basic metric for a company of what an R&D spend is, and you say spending a percentage point of your turnover in the year to try something different is actually not such a big risk. Then you find a couple of people within your power spectrum who have the vision and the audacity to say yes to that, and hopefully those are people who can sign checks, and you get a couple of them to sign on board, and you use that to essentially create the space and the idea of possibility. The key trick for us here, and this is entirely credit to my boss, is to have the confidence when you have enough space to operate to say, we're going to go for it, we're going to start, and we're going to not only build the solutions as we go along, we're going to build the coalitions of partners and the coalitions of funders as we go. So we jumped off a very, very scary, very high cliff in January this year, knowing full well that we're building the spaceship that we're flying in as we go along. But if you're going to make major changes, you need to do that. And last but not least, you need to be very clear with everybody who's supporting you on this that this may end up becoming a major train wreck. But it's worth trying anyway.
Thank you. Let's give a big hand to Joseph.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to learn more about Joseph's or Piret's work or thoughts, they have wrote blogs, and those can be found on Sitra Labs website. And actually now we have a short time for networking, and while you fill up your cup of coffee, I encourage you to speak with the people from your table and reflect on the content of these two presentations. And also Piret and Joseph will be here if you want to ask more questions from them. And just saying to online people, people here are disappearing, but because you don't have chance to reflect on tables, so maybe you can do it in the chat. Let's continue 10:30. I just heard that there would have been many more questions to Joseph and Piret, and unfortunately, because our very tight schedule, we couldn't we didn't have time for all the questions. But remember that after this presentation, we have time for open discussion. It's some sort of a panel-like discussion, and you will have time to present your questions, pose your questions then. But now, we have our third presentation almost starting. Our third speaker is the Renaissance man of system change. For example, he is a founder of Dark Matter Labs that develops institutional infrastructure and new forms of collaboration to help build more democratic futures. Please give a big hand to Indy Johar.
Good morning. I'm honored and delighted to be here. The first time I actually came to Finland and Sitra was on the bequest of one of the most amazing men I've ever met, was Mark Steinberg, who was setting up Helsinki Design Lab. Can't hear me? I'll let them. God, the punchline almost went. Yeah, hello. Hello. Good evening, Helsinki. How are we? I'll tell this. Right. Actually, what I was saying was that the first time I came to Helsinki and Finland, I was on the bequest of one of the most brilliant men I've ever met, which is Markus Steinberg. He was at Sitra setting up. I agree. He was at Sitra setting up Helsinki Design Lab after 30 years after Buckminster Fuller had done the same. And it was one of the most amazing experiences. So I'm again honored to be back and be contributing to, I think, what is a really important and significant debate. So let me start in that way. We've had two amazing speakers, and I think what I want to do is I'm going to quickly move through what I think I'm going to sort of try to frame from my perspective some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about. What I want to start the conversation by is just changing the frame a little bit. I think the next 10 years is going to be the most significant transformation in human society that we've seen in perhaps our parents' generation and perhaps even their own parents. So when we talk about change and system change, let's put it into that context. Let's put it into the context of the scale of change that's necessary. Let's also put it into the context that if you took the majority of Scandic, say Norwegian private sector organizations, right? Norwegian private sector organizations, most of them are operating on a business plan which leads to 4.5 to 5 degrees of temperature change in terms of climate change. 4.5 to 5 degrees, right? This is majority of Norwegian, some of the best, sort of many people argue, in terms of climate change. And 4.5 to 5 degrees means that about 5 to 6 billion people no longer make it on the planet. So when we talk about this transition, let's start to really get pretty serious that some of the best organizations in the world are nowhere near the scale of change that's necessary. And the scale of change that's necessary, we're nowhere near know how to do that change. So if we work on that context, one of the things that we need to start to think about is, what is this? Why do I call it transition? Everyone talks about climate change in a kind of ubiquitous, or yeah, it's happening. Watch this diagram. And 2017 was okay, 2017-18 was worse, and 2019 was even worse. So the scale of change is significant. But remember, climate change is just not about temperatures. Yes, we know that sort of parts of Canada are already 4.5 degrees warmer. Northern parts of Canada, 4.5 degrees warmer. We also know that in terms of heat island effects, many cities are going to be significantly warmer, even if we keep to within 1.5 degrees. Significantly warmer. Milan is looking at how do you deal with 4.5 degrees temperature change. And what does that mean in terms of actually reducing that? That's just temperature change. Then you look at any of the cascading effects, the quality of food and nutrition. So food nutrition has been declining all over the world. Well, we know that climate change is going to exacerbate the quality of our food, or make it worse, significantly worse. As the level of carbohydrates in our food increase, the nutrition quality declines. And the implication of that? Well, intelligence. So what we're projected to see is cognitive stumping, where the cognitive capacities of humans is declining by up to 20 IQ points in parts of the world. The UK government, when we talk about this in this sense, when we talk about the UK government, is already looking to refortify food as it did after World War II, right? This is actual current policy. So when we start to think about this from this context, I think we need to talk about this in a wider thesis. The other part I want to put down is that climate change is a symptom of a problem. Climate change is not the problem, it's a symptom. It's a symptom that's going to kill us, but it's a symptom. And too often the distraction is, let's solve climate change. Actually, there's a reason why we have climate change. There's also a reason why we've done this to the world, where 96% of mammals around the world are either humans or livestock. So the 4% that's left are the zebras, the elephants, the lions, the elk, the deer. That's 4%. So when we talk about climate change, let's also put it into the context of massive ecological destruction. And that's happened, if I judge the age in the room, pretty much in our lifetimes. 60%. So climate change is a symptom. There are a whole bunch of other systems which are actually manifesting the same issue. And I would argue, if you look at inequality, it falls into the same issue. At the same time, we're seeing a massive transformation of our economy. Yes, I'll talk about automation and all that sort of stuff. But the underlying trend is this. This is what is interesting for me, is a move from a tangibles goods economy, where we sell products and services, to intangibles. So UK is one of the most advanced intangible assets economies. Now the thing about an intangible assets economy is that it fundamentally operates differently. Intangible assets operate differently. They are sunk, they are synergistic, they're highly interwoven, they're not discrete and sellable or tradable. So I can, if this place went, didn't survive and went bankrupt, you can sell the tables to some third party. But the social networks of this place, you can't sell to a third party. That's the difference between an intangible asset and a tangible asset. Our economy is more and more reliant on intangible assets as opposed to tangible assets. That transition has fundamental implications. And it has fundamental implications in terms of how value is accrued. UK is the most advanced intangibles economy. At the same time, for all the talk of unicorns that we have to hear, and I think you are in a moment of unicorns, if I know where we are, land is the thing where value has been captured. This is all other assets. It is land. If you wanted to make money, you put your money on land. Everything else was just... There's brilliant tech entrepreneurs, tech VCs that say, you know what I do? I fund entrepreneurs who fund landlords. So in an intangibles economy, land has become the foundational rent-seeking economy. Why? Because you can't trade intangible goods in the same way. And this is a fundamental issue of recognizing where our economy is and how it's operating. At the same time, yes, we can talk about automation, but I don't really mean the robots. Everyone talks about automation through a robot lens. How many of you have heard of Bertsurger? Bertsurg? Yay, good. So one of the amazing Dutch neighborhood care companies, right? But the really interesting story about this is from 2007 to 2018, it has about 14,000 nurses, or it did when I last spoke to them, 14,000 nurses in the neighborhood. How many people do you think it had in HQ, in headquarters? Some numbers. 10. Did someone say 10? 10? Any others? They have actually 150. right, in HQ. The thing was that 150 people, which is actually, most of them are developers actually, technology people building the stack in terms of learning. But what's fascinating is what they did was they completely disintermediated managers. So when people talk about automation, what I want to talk to you about is post-managerial economies. Not post-industrial, it's when we get rid of the managers. Because that's actually what Uber did. Uber didn't get rid of the drivers yet. In fact, the drivers are going to be very difficult to get rid of. What it got rid of was the cab offices. They went. And that's exactly what we're going to see, is the disintermediation of management. And if you look at Bertsoga, what did it do? Well, the nurses got better paid, they are higher educated, better paid, and actually, I think stage 3 qualified now as opposed to stage 2, so they were better qualified, doing better work, greater autonomy, greater freedom, greater control, and we disintermediated management. So when you look around you, the challenge we have is the post-managerial economy. And actually, if you look at our cities, they're designed for managerialism. So as we saw the post-industrial age, we need to start to very quickly think about the post-managerial age and what that means for our economies and what that means for many of us. So into this context, I want us to think about this stuff together. Too often we think, right, we got the environmental people thinking about climate change, we got people thinking about inequality on the other side. Actually, this transition is fundamentally interwoven. If Macron and the yellow vests or the yellow jerseys movement showed us anything, you cannot deal with climate change without rebuilding social contracts of equality. These are interdependent issues. And it's at every level. So it's really worth thinking about this transition in a fundamentally different way to historically what we've done is we've got people dealing with this, people dealing with this, people dealing with this. I think we'll have to think about this differently. And we have to recognize this is like a war, but it's molecular. It's micro. It operates differently. It's effectively, the causes and effects are delayed, right? The kind of, the crises with cascading impacts. The impacts of climate change are cascading through our nutrition cycle, through cognitive loss. So India currently is projected to be at more than 50 degrees temperature for more than 50% of the year, parts of India. 50 degrees centigrade, more than 50% of the year for parts of India. That is non-productive. There is no productive economy left in that part of India. So when we start to think about this, how do we organize change? And this is the key issue. There's no single simplistic villain. There's no one actor. It's a Gordian knot of actors. We're all complicit in this problem. All complicit with short legacies, with private wealth stored in very different ways, what we buy, what we consume, everything. How do we unlock this is, I think, the greatest challenge of our age. The key thing is, how do we unlock it as democracies? It is no surprise that you're seeing a move towards authoritarian governments as we have failed to deal with the complexity of the challenge. And solving it through democracy is, I think, a real structural issue. And here is, I think, where the question of systems change and societal change becomes critical. And I'll give you two things. Innovation and the distribution of innovation is only as good as your ability to construct legitimacy about it. And there is a reason why the discourse is moving very quickly to cities at lower and more intimate scales, because deliberative formats allow for complex decision making. So we did a very interesting test at Impact Hub Birmingham with the brilliant Imi Cause team. And what we did was we looked at, we got a room and it said, how many people like universal basic income? We took an opinion poll right at the beginning. 70% of people said, no, these guys are going to be lazy, they're going to do nothing. They're going to go home and party and that's it. They spent the day together discussing this issue, using the web, researching it, talking to speakers. At the end of the day, that room had gone to 70% pro. it flipped. Because the nature of, so if I ask you an opinion, your opinion works on emotional, responsive, reactive intelligence. It's reptilian brain stuff. It's how you feel. Are you amongst people that you don't know, you react in that way. If I ask you that decision in a deliberative format, and you actually have time to work together, you come to a completely different decision-making structure. And you're able to deal with complex realities. So there's really good examples on this with citizen juries in Adelaide who are able to make decisions about storing nuclear waste in parts of South Australia on the basis that they recognize Australia was one of the most stable geologies in the world. So if they had to store waste, that would be a reasonable thing to do as part of a global conversation. They were able to make complex decisions when you create the deliberative format to be able to do that. So our ability to construct democracy and the legitimacy of democracy is foundational to being able to drive innovation. These two things are linked. And we're seeing insufficient innovation in our ability to construct legitimacy. And that is, I would argue, the problem is not innovation, it's the construction of that thesis. So when we talk about sort of systems change in those senses, I want to just manifest it, right? So, I'm going to give you two things. This is a chart done by the Cabinet Office in the UK around obesity. Just obesity. And all the drivers of obesity. And what you recognize here are two things you should recognize, at least. One, I'm going to ask you who should write the strategy for obesity? Right? This is the real problem. We think of it through the lens of, right, I'm going to write an obesity strategy. How do you organize that movement to operate and make change together is fundamentally a different problem to the idea of industrial management, which says, I'm going to, because I know what to do. If you're going to preserve democracy, you have to preserve the agency and the distributed agency and innovation capacity of all those actors to work independently and sometimes counter to each other whilst working to a shared ambition. There has to be enough deviation. The second part of the problem is please don't commission someone to do a systems map for you. Because the point of a systems map is not for you to feel like God looking down at the problem. The point of a systems map is actually for you and all your partners to recognize your interdependency. It is the beginning of building system intelligence, i.e. the system becomes intelligent and aware of its interdependencies. That is the purpose of the map. So if you outsource this to a consultant who comes in and does all the research, you haven't become smarter, your relationships haven't become smarter, it's of nil value other than you feeling like for a moment in the world you understood it. That's it. And the reality is it will have changed by the time you come back to you in 6 months. And JD has already built 60 labs. Right? So it's worth keeping that into the context. So, and these problems manifest themselves everywhere. In the UK, we have politicians every year standing up saying, we're going to solve the housing crisis. Every year. They stand up and say, we're going to solve the housing crisis. We're going to, nothing happens. Why? Because actually the problems are much more complicated than people want to believe, and they're Gordian knots of problems that link all the way back to how our banking system works. So the idea that you can solve the problem with a magic bullet is complete anathema. And this applies at every level. To services. This is a map of services to fragile people in parts of West Hertfordshire, done by my brilliant colleague Unji. And you can see there are so many services interacting, yet actually we all act as individual silos. And the problem too often, and this is an important point for me, is that if you want to change an outcome, this is a piece of work that we were doing with DAVSA in Dubai. They said they wanted to change the time it took for someone to be able to move to Dubai and get a job there. Now, to do that one simple thing, these were all the different agency touch points. These blue dots were every agency that had to change what they were doing. Those blue dots. So we needed to engage with at least 65 different agencies to change that one goal. That is the problem of system scale change, right? We often think about service design as being about how that one company changes that. The issue is how do you operate laterally, and that requires a different way of organizing. And also, it's worth recognizing in systems, you also have a massive issue of externalities. So when I go back to my point here about why climate change is a symptom, it's a symptom of a world which is actually allowed to create externalities, unaccounted for externalities. And that is one of the big structural issues of our age. So many people talk about Adam Smith, like him or love him, I don't really care. But if you read his Wealth of Nations book, you realize that when he talked about the market, he talked about the market when the agents of the market were local. Right? What do I mean by that? I'll give you a practical example. If the value of a forest is judged by the value of timber, because you own the forest in the middle of, I don't know, New York, then the value of that forest is just timber. It's tradable value. If the value of the forest is because you own the forest when you're living inside it, you recognize the forest's value is not just timber, but all the other interdependent services to which you're used to. So the moment of abstraction of economies also reduces the complexity of the value chains that are non-visible to us to transaction points. That has been great for many things, but it's created huge amounts of externalities. And those losses are effectively killing us. And I think it's worth recognizing the private limited company is an anathema. I'm going to give you two stories about it. Firstly, to get to the private limited company, the first private limited companies were actually royal charters. There were permissions by the king and the queens to say you are of public good. You had to prove public good, public utility. They were not about private interest. They were about public utility. So the second version of it was actually private limited companies also have a genesis in the slave trade. So they were born where actually plantation owners would own a slave, and the slave would own the plantation. And the slave and the intermediary slave would be a shield to the issues that happen on the plantation. Right? So you could extract the resources, but you were not able to be liable for the issues. This journey that we've been on in the private limited company has been very powerful for maybe 30 to 40 years, or more, maybe even 200 years. The question is it really powerful in the future? Does it work in a world of interdependency? Does it work in a world where our externalities are literally killing us? And I think all I'm saying is give ourselves permission to challenge these deep codes and these structural issues at root. I'm not saying I know what the answer is, but give yourselves the permission to do it. So the first thing is beyond the magic bullet, right? So I'm going to go back to systems things for a moment. So if you want to talk about any of the challenges that we face, recognize that there is no magic bullet and the solutions are not linear. It's a piece of work we did in Hafford, in Wales, working with a housing association. And so I'll give you a very simple example in this. I think 50% of their care staff were leaving within a year because they were actually low-paid staff and they were churning higher degrees of churn in low-paid staff, 50% turnover in staff. As a result of having a high turnover of staff, they became highly bureaucratic and form organized because they had to build corporate knowledge not through human beings, but through administrative systems. As a result of that, actually what happened, the cost overhead of the whole organization was massively inflating because you required so much administration to keep memory in the organization. So what looked like cheap staff was actually a massive complex overhead with huge quality assurance liabilities in the system. So when you look at this, these things aren't linear, what I'm saying. we were brought in to say, how do you deal with care staff? Our care staff are churning. Can we help them? It was like, well, yeah, you just pay them more, right? You change and you reduce your bureaucracy because you reduce your churn rate and you start to build a different model of accountability. And Buurtzorg have done some of this stuff already. So when you look at complex problems, these are not linear issues, and I can go into lots more detail around this. Second thing is upstream questions. Again, going back to Dubai, brought into Dubai and sort of said, right, this is part of Expo, brilliant team, said, we want to talk about food waste. And said, okay. And I had a gut feeling what they were talking about was restaurant waste. You know, man, how do we make, recycle our restaurant waste? And I was like, and we did a system analysis and said, well, the real problem is if you want to deal with food waste, go vegan. That's your real issue. Because if you map your food waste cycle, that's the thing. There is no recycling of end cycle food waste. That's an issue. I get it. But you need to go vegan. And the reality is that's probably the reality all of us are facing. In the next 10 years, we will all be near and nearabouts vegan. And if you're smart, as places like Sweden are doing, they'll be transforming their supply chains already to create vegan plant-based foods. They'll be creating the lead markets of those economies. So the question is, when you think through a system, you also change the nature of the question that you ask. And then you also change how you work. You have to work diagonally. You cannot just work at products and services. You have to work all the way down through the chain of prevention, all the way through to new technologies, new business models, new supply chains, all this infrastructure side. So innovation isn't about product services. Final point in this section. Ooh, jumped one for you. See if it works. In a systems problem, you end up with solutions like this. There isn't one solution. It's 60 different solutions and experiments. Now, traditionally, we organize ourselves and our minds to think about what can I manage. So what you do is you have this really lovely blinker. We all do it, right? It's not just you. Say, well, I can do one of these, and I can do maybe 2 of them. So let's just pick 2. But that's not how the change works. The question is, how do you organize change where you allow 40 to 50 different experiments to happen simultaneously? That is the nature of the problem. Again, this is Radical Childcare in Birmingham, just to give them a shout out. So we also need new ways of organizing, and I think this was mentioned earlier. And the new ways of organizing are, for us, have been, how do you build open inquiry? It is no longer enough to say you know what the problem is. You have to build a shared understanding of what the problem is. And that is why working out in the loud, as the Accelerator Labs are doing and many other people are doing, this is not a kind of nice to, it's a fundamental. Because you have to construct the legitimacy socially. So when Radical Childcare was being built, there were policy groups. Parents were reading policy books almost as reading clubs and having debates as parents about what they were like. So you have to build this discussion literally on the ground all the way up. You have to talk about the system capacity. What does system accounting look like when you've got 40 different organizations which are sharing an outcome in terms of young people's outcomes? How do they work together? How do they work together for shared incentives? Because the reality is we all talk systems, right? We all think, yeah, I want to be a system. But if your line manager is saying, have you done your job today? And what's your numbers of accountability? What's your KPI? Systems go very quickly out of the window. So the reality is there is a bunch of dark matter problems that sit above this idea of just cultural change to actually allow and facilitate people to work across each other collaboratively with shared KPIs, shared outcomes, and shared accountability. And how do you build shared accountability? Is it accountability to the funders, or is it accountability to the public? So what's your mechanism of building that is really key. New models of investment, there's some really interesting work we're in the middle of around system investments. So how do you invest in 40 different organizations collaborating and working together to an outcome? All the way through to kind of how you do even the R&D on that process. So the main point I'm saying here is systems change requires a new way of organizing. right? It is not so you cannot do it through the lens of still thinking about yourself in the same organizations. That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges we face. Final point in this section is about deep codes. So whilst we can talk about all the front-end stuff, I think there's a whole bunch of structural issues on the table. And the deep codes for me are these fundamental things like property rights, like private limited companies. My intuition to you, and this is what we're finding, is that these deep codes are up for renegotiation. And they're going to get renegotiated because they don't work the way we think they work, and they actually are key parts of our structural problem. And these deep codes, so we can talk about sort of future liabilities, common resources, the symptoms, heat island effects, antibacterial resistance, chronic illnesses, these are symptoms. But if you really get into the problem side, where you go deep into the system, you get into some of the more structural issues. How our budgets are organized, how our data is organized. So is data a private economy? Is it even a competitive economy? Well, really difficult, right? So data may be one of the first sets of what I call post-competitive economies. It becomes better the more you have working together. It's a new class of organizations, a new class of value that is fundamentally not about competitive value. Really problematic to those that like competing. And what they tend to argue for is natural monopolies. It's fine, right? Facebook is a natural monopoly. Well, that's not fine. It's a utility. Is it a private limited company? Really? I'm not sure. So we have to start to think about different layers of behaviors. And I would argue that we're entering a new stage of digital utilities, which operate fundamentally at a different, almost at a foundational economy sense, that need to be seen as new structural value points in our economy that have to be shared. Not necessarily state-owned, but they have to be of public value. We don't have to conflate public with state. State is not public. That's the other conflation that I really don't like. Right? Public is at the intersection of actually markets, state, civil society, and learned societies. It's at the intersection point. Why? Because all of these are different decision-making mechanisms. The state is a model of decision-making. The market is another model of decision-making. Learned societies are another model of decision-making. And civil community organizations are another model of decision-making. And it is at the interface of this is the public is born, at the negotiation of this. And I think one of the things that it throws up is how do we start to rebalance our economy into some of those realities. And these deep code issues exist at every level. Bureaucracy, governance, finance, social norms. A tree outside. Where do you think a tree sits on the balance sheet of a local authority? Has a tree got any value? No. It sits as a cost and a liability on the accounting side. Why? Lots of different reasons. But all the environmental services of trees, whether it's carbon sequestration, sustainable urban drainage, heat island effects, these are nil value currently because our accounting system doesn't account for them. And as a consequence, what tends to happen is we tend to replace older trees because their roots get too large with younger trees. Now, here's a killer. Only when a tree gets to about 40 years does it really start to provide the environmental services that we need. It's at 40 years it provides the canopy production, the heat island effect reduction, the carbon sequestration. All the environmental services we need is at 40 years. But we cut them down. Tree lives are, in the UK, I know this, is about 10 years on average. You replace a tree every 10 years because you don't want its roots to undermine housing. And this is a function of actually our relationship with the world. So I'm giving you these examples because I think it's really important. So Gibson, a town in Canada, has put an aquifer on the balance sheet of the city. A natural asset which sits on the balance sheet of the city because it provides water quality, water with such high quality that it's not needed to be treated at all. So there are some really interesting moves going on as a result of this. But my point being, it is only when you look at these structural issues can you change the terms of the debate. I'm not interested in saving one tree. I'm not interested in saving 2 trees. What I'm interested in is how do we reclassify our relationship with environmental services? Right? That's the challenge. And why is that challenge? Milan is looking to plant 3 million trees over the next 10 years. Every country I know is committing to this. So the question is, how do we re-gear this and actually acknowledge this in fundamentally different ways? Milan is also looking at how do you reduce car miles traveled by 50% in the next 10 years. Car miles traveled in the city by 50%. That changes the economic geography of pretty much the whole of Milan. How you work, where you work, what last mile distribution works like, it all changes. So if you want to know the scale of the change that they're facing, that is the scale. So, some boring things. One, the frame. The frame is everything. Piece of work we're doing in Sweden, and Stockholm actually, with the city region. So we were asked to come in on mental health, and one of the big things we recognized was Sweden is one of the, Stockholm produces more unicorns than anywhere else in the world other than Silicon Valley. And what we started to get them to do was think about mental health as the foundational gold of their future economy. This is a Horizon 1 issue, right? The frame is a Horizon 1. Too often we go for Horizon 3s, which is actually don't need to worry about monetary wealth in this classic format. But Horizon 1 is linking foundational gold of mental health to actually the thriving of their economy. Not seeing it as a cost, not seeing it as a liability, not seeing it as a moral crusade, but seeing it as a foundational basis of how you build this. Then it was actually about recognizing what is failure to treat, the cost of failure to treat. What is the cost of treatment? What is the cost of prevention? And here's the killer. What's the value of thriving? Right? In the 19th centuries, when we were all living in slums, many of us were, actually, we recognized that in order to build our labor economy, we had to do massive amounts of rehabilitation of our cities and places we worked and lived in order to build the environment for labor to thrive. And I use the word labor. In the in the early 21st century, our cognitive contributions, our contributions to society are going to be emotional intelligence, cognitive intelligences, these new high-class human interaction points. What is the city and environment required to thrive in that context, and how do we unleash it is actually a systematic question. And is of the same order. I don't even think we know what good mental health is yet. We know what is bad mental health from our current position. But let's imagine there's 40% more to be achieved. What would that look like? How would we behave differently? What is the new norms? So there's a huge transition. My point being, then you can look at the point of the individual, you can look at the point of social networks, you can look at environmental societal issues. Do you know that 50% urban environments have a 50% higher schizophrenia rate than rural environments? 50% higher. So mental health in urban conditions, you could argue the city is no longer functional for actually mental health. And then you can go to the deep code issues. My point being here that unless you change the frame of the debate, you cannot change the nature of the tools and devices in the story. And that's a really and this was a political conversation, not just, and I mean political as in small p rather than big P. It was about how you relinked a debate to make it structural and recognized as part of a bigger flow, and then linked actually the framework within it. Second part is moving into private and civic economies. How many of you know the High Line in New York? It's cool, lovely, right? Here's a little piece of, we've been doing some piece of work where we've been researching the High Line in terms of, it cost $278 million to build. $278 million. If you took, here's a question for everyone. If you just took 10% of the land value uplift attributable to the High Line alone, discounting Manhattan, discounting New York, discounting all the other interventions, how many years do you think it would take to pay for the High Line? Some numbers. Month. I'll give it 10. 10 months. It's the best business model there ever is. No private business model beats that. So what we've seen here is a classic notion, and I'll show you. This was some of the distribution work that we were doing. Again, you can see this on a blog called A Smart Commons that's published by us. And the point being here is civic goods create private value, not the other way around. And historically, maybe not in Finland and the Scandics, but what we've seen is civic goods being privatized, their value being privatized in private housing markets. So civic goods create private value, and what we've seen is the value of civic goods being privatized in private housing markets. So what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. How many of you have houses here, right? Your houses have gone up massively in value, I assume, right, in the next 10 years. If I took your house and moved it to Nova Scotia, how much is it worth? Not much, right? So the value of your house, after you take away the construction value and the utility value, the value of your house comes from, here's the key words, the monopolistic access to labor markets, schools, parks, all those things that we know and need. They come from common goods. So if your house has gone up in value, unless you built an extra room, made it zero carbon, most of the value that's come from is actually from public goods going up in value to which you have a monopolistic right on. Bit of a killer. Right? And we've seen a massive transfer of wealth from civic goods to their privatized value. Housing. And so the question becomes, how do you rebalance that? And again, we're doing some work around smart governance, new ways to deal with some of that stuff. So why am I saying that? When you can start to unbundle property rights into radically different formats and link them in different ways, because the cost of technology and the cost of kind of administration is near zero, you can start to open up different types of relationship. The thesis of property works very well when actually the cost of administration and the complexity of administration is very high. When your cost of administration becomes really low, you can start to create linked value in ways that you couldn't. So there's a paradigm shift coming in the nature of our bureaucracy, which is going to change the nature of how we attribute value. That is a real game changer, and I don't care what the capitalists say, it's going to create value. The next business models of the 21st century will be about civic goods. Third point, how am I doing for time? Oh, that's fantastic. I was like, whoa. Okay, next point I want to talk about is governance. So I'm going to try to unlock this whole diagram and then sort of talk about it. The other big challenge we're in the middle of is the future of governance, and I think this is really important. Two key theses. One, I would argue the biggest failures that we've seen over the last 30 years has been a failure of governance. There's a brilliant question about corruption earlier. I would like to take a slightly different point of view. I think we've become fully systematically corrupted. I think our incentives are corrupted. I think if people are not dealing with climate change with business models that run at 4.5 degrees, that is a systematic indicator of corruption. If people are willing to let 5 billion people die, that is a corrupted system. So let's take a reframe on this conversation. And I include the UK in this. I include all the Western economies in this. I do not believe there is a substantive difference between the Western economies and the developing economies. I think we're all corrupted. Let's start with that mindset, because the incentives have become misaligned to human survival. That's the baseline problem. So if you work from that thesis, if you are producing huge amounts of CO2 and using carbon-intensive industries, the reality is you are self-terminating human life. That is a corrupted behavior. I'm not saying the individuals are at fault. I'm saying we have a failure in governance. And we've had a systematic failure of governance over the last 30 years, if you account for the crap that we're living in. I think it's healthy for us to not to try to pretend otherwise. And it's not about blaming anyone else either. It's about recognizing it so we can all move on. And when you talk about this, I think we have to think about governance in fundamentally different ways. And I think one of the big issues that we've had is all the debate in the world, maybe not in Helsinki and Finland, but most of the debate in the world has been, how do we reduce the red tape for business? And it's not about reduction of red tape, it is about radically reimagining what the red should be. It is about building the capacity to reimagine governance fit for a 21st century. And that will open up huge new markets and huge new possibilities. It might kill off old industries, and rightly so, but it will not destroy human economies. It will create new economies. The best example I've had is I was speaking to one of the top fund managers in Scotland. What did they say? They said, climate change? It's bigger than China multiplied by the internet. That's how much value it's going to create. It's going to destroy a shitload of value. It's going to create a shitload of value. That's a monetary perspective. And so the question is, we are in this structural transition. We have legacy holders who are locked into governance models. So the question is, how do you reinvent governance, and to what end? So our governance models all assume us to be machines. So if Kate Raworth was here, she'd talk about rational man. She'd say, you know, all of our thinking has been predicated on the idea of rationality. I make individual rational decisions. It's not even true at any level. You don't make decisions, even at market level, on the basis of rationality. You make decisions on the basis of mimesis, copying, which is why many of the big corporations in the world spend time on marketing. It's nothing to do with marketing. They're trying to help you copy behaviors. Because you do not make rational decision making. That is a fallacy. It's too complicated to make rational decisions by fully understanding everything about a product. You copy your friends, you copy the adverts, you copy this stuff. So even the thesis of how market functionality works is fundamentally challengeable. And that's not me talking, that's people like Peter Thiel talking, some of the most rabid market people in the economy. I'm not even talking about myself, I'm talking about the people that are really pushing this conversation. They recognize this reality. So the question becomes, how do you imagine this for a human economy, a human rule-based economy, a machine-to-machine economy? We are going to have different models of governance into these futures. How many of you have done Coder's law work? What does that mean? Automated decision making. What does that drive? What are the implications? How do we operate in predictive economies in a volatile world? We need to be starting to think quite structurally about the future of governance, and it will not be. One thing we know is it's not going to be fixed, it's not going to be analog. We're able to do contingent law. I can give planning permission not on the basis of, yes, that place is a restaurant. I can say, as long as it doesn't produce noise, as long as it doesn't produce smells. I can do real-time monitoring of that. I can open up the use of public realm, real-time on my phone, on licensing. This will change the nature of our city works if we see governance as a means of actually releasing capacity in the way we've not imagined. So I haven't got enough time to really go into details on this, but it's a significant issue. And this is also really important. Governance Horizon 1, the way our governance is currently organized is about loosely bound. So between compliance and activity, there's a loose relationship. Technology wants to drive us to be tightly bounded. You cannot drive more than 30 kilometers an hour. That is tightly bounded because your car automatically stops you. The problem with that thesis is it's about centralization. Whereas actually there are other models of how you use digital governance, which is about ennobling. How do you make you better as a person to make you more noble to make the right decision? You can also do that with huge amounts of actually machine learning capacity to help you be better, help you be more noble, help you be more caring. They are also facets of actually how we reimagine governance, not only through a control mindset. And there's a whole bunch of opportunities around that. I can not really get into this, but all the way from how we do licensing, all the way through land value capture, the role of media in terms of urban landscapes, this is work we're doing at TfL. I'm going to jump through this. I've probably got 2 minutes left. So 1 minute. One, okay. So I'm going to give, okay, from ownership, the other thing I want to talk about, I'm going to give you headlines here, which are important. Ownership is not the only way. there is significant, interesting conversation going on about post-ownership societies. Ownership is a mechanism, was a tool, useful tool. It may have come to the end of its life cycle. I'm going to leave it as a tantalizing conversation. You should pick it up. I think it's worth thinking about. What is a post-ownership society? And there are other ways of dealing with governance. And here I was going to talk about warranties, licensing. One of the big things I would say on circular economies, do not fall into the trap that circular economies are about Ford owning everything. That is a trap of building rent-seeking economies, because we all become renters of big corporates. And what we're seeing is a massive shift to our economy to rent-seeking capacities. So the question becomes, how do you make sure that in terms of the ownership cycle in circular economies, it isn't centrally owned? There's some really good work going on, and we're doing some of that, which is to explore how even Ford would have to lease the raw materials of natural goods, of public assets. So they are also a lessee. So they don't become natural owners of the asset, which means that you can actually have a non-locked-in economy. So just look at the future of circular economies. You need to be part of that conversation and not let it default into private rent sharing. Looking at transitions, for how you go from that world to that world, again, accounting problems, all the other things I've spoken about. Non-rivalrous economics is a key issue. In an interdependent world, we cannot afford structural rivalry. There are whole classes of value which are only more valuable when they become non-rivalrous. Data is one aspect of it. There's some interesting questions about even AI and machine learning capacities, which are going to have to be in many ways non-rivalrous to unlock that value. So keep an eye on thinking about some of that stuff in really radical ways. Beyond burning the red tape, I've already largely spoken about. Again, these things are important. Future of licensing, future of contracting. This is the big revolution. Going from contracting one-to-one to contracting many-to-many. That is what opens up huge possibilities of transforming the business model of change. It fundamentally goes from being private economies to civic economies, because I can contract many people to many people in a single model. Smart contracts, not necessarily blockchain, can deliver some of those values. These are things about regulatory sandboxes, but again, regulatory sandboxes are very interesting. We're doing some work with Waterfront Toronto on some of this stuff. Have a look it up. It's Legitimacies IQ, all public in the public domain. Lead markets. I'm going to end very quickly, but my point here is this transition is going to create new markets. It is not just the destruction of value, it's also about the creation of new models of value. And bear that in mind in your thesis. And how do you go from understanding these risks to making some of those hedges and strategic investments as part of the portfolio? Again, how do you understand the metabolic flows? And these are going to be some of the tools that we have to think about. How do we understand the system of flows that are coming into our city? How do you pick the lead markets that you want to operate in? How do you want to transition off the back of them? And how do you build the experiments? So this is all around food. If you wanted to change food buying of schools all the way through, what would that look like? What would the kind of type of instruments that you would need and models of change that you would need on the process side? Final point, that is what a portfolio of experiments looks like. This is, again, what we've been doing in Mindshift in Stockholm. These are a whole bunch of experiments on deep code, environmental, social network, individual, treatment, prevention, thriving. It's a portfolio. If you want to drive change, some of our best thinking is around that. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to try and see. Well, maybe. All of that, I think these questions are the things that you need to also think about. It's not only about doing. Lots of people will stand there and say, do stuff. It's about being a philosopher maker. No one knows what this future looks like. Not me, not anyone. So you have to become philosopher makers. If you look back at a brilliant book called The Nordic Secret, which talks about how the Scandics were able to make the transition, one of the best things about it was that you built there were Volk schools, people schools built in the early 19th century. And those people schools meant that people were in their 30s, late 20s, spent 6 months going to a school learning philosophy and making. 10% of the population had gone to those schools, from Denmark to Sweden, I think probably in Finland, but certainly in Norway. 10% of the population, which is why the Scandics have been one of the most progressive and were able to make a massive rise, because they were able to marry philosophy and making. In an unknown world, you have to have the capacity to self-author and self-think and self-make. Don't believe anyone who just says just do. They're just trying to instrumentalize you. Big questions. Freedom in an independent age. What does that really mean? Is it the freedom to escape, or is it the freedom to care? Democracy in a post-privacy world. How does that really work? How do we enshrine it? How do we look after it? What is agency in a predictive economy? Is the predictive economy even real? Can we predict in a volatile world? Or actually, is that the biggest arbitrage there is? Anyone who predicts is open to arbitrage in a volatile world. Work beyond humans as labor. Humans, I think the classifications of humans as labor in a cognitive economy, emotional labor, high-performance cognitive economies will operate fundamentally differently. The labor laws of the 21st century or the human cognitive laws will be radically different and need to be so. Think hard about those. What does governance look like in an age of complexity, which I think is a really important issue, which I think governance at the point of complexity is not about control. It's about ennobling and self-governing systems, which are actually accountable in radically different ways. You have to re-engineer the system quite substantively. And that ends with the bigger question, which I think you should all be asking. How do you build the capacity to do this change? And in that capacity question, I think it's really important to stop thinking there isn't enough money. We're about to see the largest, I would say in the next 10 years, largest investments in the European Union that we've seen. Across, I think we'll see it, whether we like it or not. Across the world, we'll see it. Because the scale of the transition is so large. The question is, how will you deploy that capital and not waste it propping up the old system, but genuinely create the 21st century economies and societies that we need? That, I think, is the scale of the challenge. I would no longer be worrying about the money. The money will come. In fact, there's lots of money out there already. The question is, how do we deploy it? And building the capacity to deploy it and building the legitimacy to deploy it is, I think, the real structural challenge. Otherwise, there's a risk we just prop up the old. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Indy. You will get this presentation and also Piret's and Joseph presentations afterwards, so don't worry about it, even though we didn't see all the slides. And yeah, I guess we move on to the questions. So there are many questions. Mia, would you bring the microphone? I can take care of that.
Thanks so much for that presentation. I think everyone's with me in just being totally mind blown. It's easily one of the best presentations I've seen ever. So great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, yeah, so I have a lot of things to say, but I just wanted to jump straight to the beef, really, which was clearly you're able to visualize at a systemic level and explain the forces at play at a systemic level very, very deeply and well. But when it came to your experiments itself, it was hard to see at this resolution and distance what a particular experiment looked like. So when you think of a particular intervention at like level 6 in a very complex system, how do you go about that? What does an experiment look like? How do you set metrics to it? And what's the relationship of that experiment to the whole system?
It's a really good question, and I'll tell you how we're figuring it out. Like, again, I'm not saying this is the truth, it's just how we're figuring it out. So what we figured out was when we understood the thesis, say, for example, of how civic goods create private value. Then we turned around and said, what is the best world-known example of that? We went to the High Line. Then we retrospectively modeled all the data. Retrospectively, or what the evidence was. We created retrospective the evidence, compiled the evidence, and then what we're building is we're modeling smart covenants onto all those properties, and what would have happened real time had that covenant be based. So off the back of modeling that, and then what we're looking at is how do you construct democratic legitimacy. So we're reverse engineering all the experimental data using that history, and then building back out from there. So that's step one. We're doing very similar for trees, where there's some brilliant black swans. So these are all black swan examples. So we then reverse engineer back into how the value was created. So we started by we took the story, the anecdotal story, then we did the ethnographic research, figuring out who the people were. Off the back of that, built out the evidence base. Off the back of the evidence base, then say, if you added these interventions, how would those numbers have changed? What would be the hypothesis? And then off the back of that, move forward. So that's how we're doing it. It's a bit boring, but there is a really good blog called A Smart Commons where we are openly publishing everything. We try to open publish everything, open source everything, because we recognize we cannot do this alone, right? So we open everything up.
Thank you. Then we have time for 2 more short questions and answers. Please.
Hi, Indy. Thanks. Now I have to spend the rest of the month processing all of this, so thanks. I'm interested in about 7 different domains, and I have some competence in them, and occasionally I get to a conversation with somebody who's firmly located in one of those domains, and we start talking about a problem which I know is related to some of the other ones. What's a practical thing I can do to coax that person out of their domain and to see that they can't solve their problem within those confines? They have to engage with the other ones.
The classic thing is about accountability to the outcome. So the classic thing is about accountability to the outcome. Move people from focusing. So I think the biggest problem, so if you talk to an architect and you say, I have a problem, the architect will always tell you 90% of the time, 99% of the time, it's a building. Because they are, we are basically designers of a medium. We have a solution, and we'll tell you, whatever your problem is, I have a hammer, and I'll nail it, right? And the problem is that if you want to talk about outcomes, which is saying, what are you actually trying to do? Well, actually, I'm trying to make the city better. Then you have different types of solutions. So I think the biggest psychological journey that you have to do is take people away from this idea of competency in roles and behaviors to actually what is their strategic objective that they're trying to play towards, and then talk about what else do we need around us to be able to do that. That's really the biggest that's what we've seen. And people that are willing to play for the outcomes are the people that we want to work with. And then there's people playing for politics, and they are not so easy to work with.
Thanks. And 1 more if there is, before we move on. Yeah, here in the middle.
Thank you. Since you come from the UK, I think it's only appropriate to ask you this question. And since you just mentioned politics, so how do you situate Brexit in this whole entire
short questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I really loved JD's map. I don't know if you guys saw the UK had been wiped out in JD's map. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. We're really off the map right now. Where do I see it? Okay, honest answer is I think at multiple levels. It's not straightforward. I think Brexit is a signal of pretty much stuff that's happening everywhere. It's manifesting in one form, which is through the European Union, but actually this is about how economies are dealing with wage stagnation, massive societal level threats. And what we're seeing is what we're seeing everywhere is everyone slowly hunker down, go to the lowest common unit. And we're seeing that pretty much everywhere, whether in some format or another, whether it's the rise of the far right or other things. And the problem is that actually we haven't yet had the expansive conversations and the capacities to build, I think, some of the alternative discourse that needs to be happening, right? And I think that is one of the big issues. And I think we're still locked into either preserving old world conversations or trying to hunker down and saying, well, we'll ride out the storm individually. And the reality is both those aren't going to work. So I think, I see it in that way, and I can go into much more of, well, you know, where we are and why I think, but I think perhaps we can do that over a coffee or something. But thank you.
Thank you. Let's give a big hand once more. So we have the final discussion left when we get all our rock stars once more to the stage. Give us 1 minute and we make sure that the stage is okay.
And I'd really like to thank all of you for your really engaging and great discussions. I really like the narrative. We didn't actually plan for a narrative, but But I noticed that we started off with public sector system change with Piret's talk. Then we went global, talking about like how do we organize learning in globally so that we can solve these things. And then we got into the really deep questions of changing the deep code globally, which what Indy was starting to talk about. And after like this type of expansive narrative, I think it would be really nice for us and the audience to take a notch a little bit back and go from out there into in here. And a question that we at Sitra Lab are hoping to help the Finnish society find answers to is how we should do systems change here in Finland, and especially in a Nordic context. So we've been discussing with a lot of our international partners related to the topics, and what we hear is that we don't have a welfare state, for example, in most of the countries, and especially in the Nordics, the welfare state is a lot about the welfare of humans rather than the welfare of the planet. So the ecological issues might be a little bit to the side. So I know that Piret is working in Finland, and Indy is doing a lot of work in Sweden, and JD is meeting up with a lot of people in Finland. So I'd like to ask you all single questions related to system change in Finland and the Nordics, and then we'll open the discussion and additional questions to the audience. So Piret, I understand that you're working in Finland with issues related to children, and listening to the systems change and systems thinking presentation you just gave us, have you noticed that is there some kind of gap between the language that we as global innovators are using and people who are actually working with children? So have you what kind of issues have you got into in this type of connection about these very big things and really practical things?
Mm-hmm. So our work in child-centered policy within Finland is actually starting. So it's very difficult to comment at the moment about the things, but I can say that the level of ambition, at least, as I mentioned, one of the core supporting factors in Finland is very, very high to actually do something very differently. But again, it's not going to be enough. So you have to actually put that ambition into actions as well. So we work together with Norway, with Sweden, with Denmark as well on different issues. So we have a little bit of a perspective of what makes the Nordic special. So I think in Nordic countries, all Nordic countries are of course different. So in Norwegian is a little bit different than Sweden, and it's different from Finland as well. But I think that what is kind of a common narrative within Nordic countries and the Nordic welfare state as well is that you have kind of these factors that actually support systems change. You have a kind of a country where you have a lot of social capital. So it's easy to actually pick up the phone and call someone. Nobody wants to do that anymore, but it is actually easy to do that. So you have, this kind of interconnectedness of different angles. And especially in Sweden and in Finland as well, there is a great potential to have the potential to have partners from the outside as well. So companies, firms, international companies that do amazing work, that, to build up this, different partnerships between both private and public sector partners and universities to have these kind of interdisciplinary teams for systems change, because that's kind of the only way to reach for kind of new ideas and have creative solutions. So I think that is something that is extremely important. And I think regardless of what is being said, I think that also trust in government to actually do this type of work in Nordic countries is higher than elsewhere in the world. So if you actually look at the statistics, Finland is of course very concerned about these issues. But actually citizens do trust you. In Nordic countries, citizens trust the government to actually make the right choices. The trust is declining, but there is more of it. So you can actually use it for this kind of work itself.
Great, thanks, Piret. And you can give the microphone to JD next. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, great. Yeah. So JD, what I've been really inspired by the work of Accelerator Labs is that actually you didn't talk a lot about innovation, even though you were talking a lot about innovation, and the context for this whole thing is innovation. You were rather talking about creating the opportunities for learning really fast. And I think this is a really interesting point in shifting from this type of product and service-centered innovation in which, you know, we have small teams that are going to disrupt the world essentially into this type of societal innovation where you actually need everybody to learn and everybody to live their capacities to do things in a new way. So what might we do in Finland to promote this type of approaches?
Let me give you a broader answer from our context. One of the reasons why in describing what we do internally and with our partners, we don't talk about it explicitly as innovation, but rather we talk about knowledge generation and learning, is because certainly within the system we work in and in our organization, I think there's been a bit of a tendency recently to pigeonhole innovation as something that's done by a small group of people. Whereas fundamentally, our argument, our narrative amongst our people is every one of us, if you are a thoughtful professional who's trying to do your job better every day, instinctively you're innovating in big ways, in small ways. The approach of things like the labs, the methods and tools we talk about there are just ways to systematize and improve how you do this, to get better at doing it. But I think certainly for us, our experience has been we needed to get past that perception that innovation is a thing done by a subset of cool people who don't have to do regular jobs, so they have the luxury of fiddling about the edges. Now, I can't speak very much about the context. You know, my knowledge of Finland and Helsinki is deep. I've been here slightly over a day now. So I don't want to sort of overinterpret, but I would say I see this challenge in many places as well. So I guess the question back to you is, if you're talking about dealing with the big societal challenges that countries in this region face, first of all, how do you get people to recognize these challenges exist? And how do you get people to recognize that the solutions need to be generated, as you said, by everybody and not just palmed off onto the innovators and the smart thinkers?
Great, thanks, JD. And Indy, you were talking about a lot of things. You mentioned your work in Sweden, and you mentioned that, in other parts of your presentation that collaboration at a really high scale, maybe even global scale, is really relevant for us to solve these big problems. But in Sweden, they're doing this in a smaller scale, but really with the transformative mindset that you were describing in a lot of your things. So what's happening in Sweden? And
I'm going to answer two things. One, I just wanted to pick up something that I think you asked JD, and I think one of the things that's worth recognizing why Accelerator Labs are really powerful is I don't think I've seen an initiative of doing 60 systems interventions simultaneously, right, or 78, right? It's the scale. So too often what happens is, oh, we'll set up a lab when you set up one. Actually, the question is, how do you build that scale of systematic learning and movement? I think that's one thing that's worth acknowledging, and it's worth thinking about in a way, if you're doing system change in sort of Finland, is one lab enough, or do you need a network? Do you need capacity? The second thing is, what's the function of the lab? And I agree completely with JD here that the function of the lab isn't to do the innovation per se. It's to being an enabling infrastructure and for building the collective intelligence and the capacity of change within the wider system. So it's not trying to imagine that these are cool 5 people that can invent the world. And I think that's a fundamental issue at that scale. So one, I would say that Accelerator Labs, for me, are groundbreaking because I've never seen a global investment of that order. And now we are seeing, say, Viable Cities is working at 9 cities across Sweden. So 9 cities across Sweden, a seed fund of 100 million euros, which is looking at how you invest 100 million in supporting cities transform. That seed fund is now being opened up to a new conversation at European Union level, looking at 100 million for 100 cities and driving that transition. So that's what I meant by the capital being less and less the problem. I think what we have to talk about is how do we drive that change and distribute the capital and agency to spend. That's the other thing that I think is really critical, is too often our investment in innovation is too centralized. And we have to be able to distribute the agency and the investment capacity throughout countries. So one of the big conversation in the UK that we've been having with Nesta, for example, and there's a report coming out next year, is we need city-level endowments. Nesta at a national level is not enough. Birmingham needs actually its own capacity for innovation investment. So my pushback to Sitra would be, how do you build Sitra in every city in Finland? Because that's what's necessary. It's no longer possible to command and control and see that stuff at a local level. And that, I think, is part of the kind of systems that I think Accelerator Labs is showing, is building their distributed capacity. It's critical.
Thanks so much. And one of the things that Kalle mentioned in the beginning that we're working on actually is innovation portfolios. And one aspect of innovation portfolios is that how can we democratize it? So that's a question that we are opening for discussion. But yeah, now we can move into the questions that you people might be having. Who wants to start?
I have a question that has still somehow is related to corruption. And we hear many times that people who do, they don't worry about what's going on in the politics. They just do. And is that something you recognize, and is that going to make it possible for the doers, the changers, the makers to achieve, even if all the political struggle and polarity and corruption is going on? Do you advise us as doers to just go and do it and hope for the best?
Okay, I think I'm the only person here who hasn't talked about the corruption question yet. So let me give you my 2 cents on that one, which isn't a direct answer to your question, because the short answer to your question is yes, I think doers have to do. But reflecting back to the question that I think Pirette was asked earlier in the morning about corruption in the system, I was mulling over if you could imagine looking at the system through 4 characteristics. Where is the power? Who has the power? Where is the information? The balance between the holders of power and the availability of information is how you manage corruption. And secondly, in terms of the potential to do something that is corrupt, whether you're talking about an individual act of corruption or the systems level corruption that Indy is talking about, how do you as a society manage the risk and the reward? So if you come back to the point Indy was making about validly a lot of the corruption in our systems now being baked into the system rather than into the acts of individuals, how do you change the system so that the societal acceptance of that corruption goes away? I don't know whether many people here have been following this, but there's been an interesting thread popping up in a lot of social narratives in the last couple of months about billionaires being a symptom of policy failure. That we need to move to a world where we stop lionizing billionaires as being ultra-successful epitomes of achievement that we need to emulate and adore, but rather the fact that societies allow wealth accumulation on that breathtaking scale to be a societal policy failure. That's where you shift the permission space in a society to no longer allow these kind of behaviors to be acceptable. So I tend to look at corruption from a systems point of view in terms of how do you change the levers, the level of acceptability within a system, rather than how do you catch and punish individual actions.
Exactly, and I want to pick up on the point of doing equals corruption a little bit as well, in a sense that, and that is something that we also, that is something of fear a lot of people actually want to do change work or innovation work within the public sector specifically have as well. It's like how I can do these trials or methods or work together with people, like these specific companies that have the solution. I know that there are the people there that I could could actually draw upon to develop that solution. So how I can work with them in a kind of a pre-arranged procurement system that most public sector organizations have. And does that actually mean de facto that this is corruption? So if you do that, this is corruption. So actually, there are different ways of doing that as well, and we want to have accountable, transparent public sector. So we don't want to have these systemic corruptions that we actually don't call corruptions at the moment. We just say, well, let's call them, reframing the problem. So billionaires actually is a policy problem or a policy failure. I love that policy frame as well. But on the ground, when you're actually talking to innovators themselves, it's about, we have worked in Brazil, for example, and Brazil, the corruption issue is a much bigger issue than here, and it's a politicized issue. If you're a civil servant in Brazil, you can be taken into court. You can, for paying with the wrong card at the gas station for gas money for a company car or a public sector car, government car, you can actually land in court and be sentenced as a criminal for doing a corruptive deed. The system is overgeared towards this issue because it has been a long-term issue. It's a politicized issue. And yet people there find ways to also do innovative work. So one of the groups that we're working together with, their method is, okay, I'm going to make these choices, but I'm actually going to put it down. I'm going to write it up. I made this choice because. And I make my choices transparent. So it's transparent all the way to the auditors while I'm making those choices as well. I will send it to the auditors right away to say, I'm going to make these choices. If you have a better choice for me, tell me now while I'm doing it. And this is also an ex-ante way to say, I have been transparent. If you weren't there to tell me that this was corruptive behavior or this was wrong in some way or format, where were you then? Because I have taken every single step to actually make my choices apparent. So you can make actually riskier choices, you can work together with different people, so there's a way around working it as well. So not being an innovator doesn't mean that I will do things in a privacy or in a hidden format. You can actually do it in a transparent format as well, and explain why you actually make those choices that you make.
Great, thank you. And how about, is there a next question somewhere in the audience?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's working. Yeah. No, it's not a political question this time. Your presentations were eye-opening, and at the same time, they caused a level of discomfort. I could sense that. And how uncomfortable these conversations can be, these are crucial conversations. I wonder, when you do talk to innovators, impact makers, and when you do create that sense of discomfort in them, how do you hold the space so that they, decision makers, don't freeze, or the next day they don't go into business as usual? How do you hold that space, and how do you follow up on that? Thank you.
Does Indy want to start there?
Thank you for the question. I think so my intuition is slightly different. So having given, say, this presentation to pretty senior government officials or similar, very high up, Director General level actually, what the first word that they used was, this is guilty knowledge. Like, I feel like I have knowledge that I need to be able to enact. So the really interesting thing was they didn't feel like, they were like, okay, this is, I think most people are aware of this stuff. There's not that much I've said that's actually genuinely, fundamentally, oh my God, new. Most people are aware, either consciously or unconsciously, of most of this stuff. The only thing that I've tried to do is crystallize that in a way that allows us to perceive it and crystallize that risk. And that, I think, is helpful. So it takes away ambient worries and makes it discrete. And that discreteness and the crystallization actually is supportive. So I think the real challenge is, I think most senior people right now, many of the senior people know this is we're up shit creek without paddle, you know. There is a real palpable awareness that we are in trouble. And one of the kind of interesting questions was, whether we talk about, you know, the political swings that we're facing, actually in system theory, when you go through change, that political swing is actually quite helpful. That's actually health. The ability to be able to swing is actually about recalibration. So we're in the midst of a recalibration. Most people are aware of it. So I think the real crisis is trying to pretend the old is still viable. That's what actually makes people deeply uncomfortable. I think if you had been speaking 4 years ago, I would have agreed with you. I think the other thing is much more the way we're seeing senior decision makers right now. When you get really down to it and they're not having to pretend, like, you know, most senior leaders are still having to publicly pretend. London is going to be fine, we'll grow at 3%. You know, the population of London will be 9 million. Right? That's what the public narrative is. You go into the private, there's a different conscious narrative. And that, I think, is starting to happen already.
So, I think, yes. So I think my experience with senior leaders is somewhat similar to Indy's, but also in a way different. In a sense that if there is collective responsibility over a problem, then nobody sees it as a problem at all. So we watch news every single day. We watch news and the CNN reports about the awful things going on in the world. And yet we can go to bed and do nothing about it. You know, collectively, individuals will say, I can live with this. I will put it out of my head. And it is a very human behavior, because this is how you actually deal with things. This is how you deal with things in a world that produces a lot of horrible things. And leaders, also senior leaders, and you yourself within whatever organization you work for, also deal with these complex issues the same way. You say, well, we are all collectively responsible. I'll just go to bed and sleep a good night, and I'm not going to stay awake thinking about this. So for me, in reality, it is actually, how do I create the uncomfortable feeling for a longer period of time, and how do I connect that feeling to the fact that this will influence your life or your job, to get that to the connection. So now with the climate movement and the values changing, I don't talk about the effects of climate or the system to the politicians. I talk about the fact that you see all those kids on the streets. Those are your voters. In 5 years, 4 years, 3 years' time, you are going to lose elections. Your standing within your system or what you care about is going to crumble because they have different values. So it's actually making that uncomfortable feeling, like human beings, we all know this is wrong, we should do something about it. But something very visceral, something very that is connected to the motivations of those people that they go to work and think about every single day. So it's connected to those kind of things that will keep you up at night. So making that connection that will make people move.
Great, thank you. And looking at the time, we're already nearing 12 o'clock because we've had so great talks and really engaging discussions. So we'll give the mic to Salla again.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So these 3 hours have flown past, and we got a lot to consider and extremely useful new information. Next time, maybe works better here. Or not. So, well, next time we will have Herram event on the 11th of December, and this time in Starters Helsinki restaurant at Maria 01, where we used to have this earlier. And this time the topic is about collaboration from multiple perspectives. The enrollment is open, so be quick and book your seat and breakfast. We were really happy to see so many of you here, and I was very happy also to see so many new faces, people who found us through Slush website and our Slush side event. But thank you for joining us, and hopefully see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of the week.